You've been pretty vocal on Twitter even today. You've called the company corrupt and evil. Why aren't you giving them any credit for this discount?
I wish I could. I wish this was a moment of celebration, that we could see that there was some fundamental change coming that was really going to change how things have been working on the App Store. Unfortunately, it's not. As the math you just showed, this doesn't change anything for Apple. This applies to 5% of the App Store revenue. It is marketed as a mail-in rebate that you have to apply for. So even if 100% of developers who are eligible for this program applied for it, it would only result in an impact on 2.5% of the revenue that goes into the App Store. So that tells you just the magnitude of this change, which is very little at all. And the change here really is much more of a Machiavellian ploy to try to split the developer base by throwing away some cheap concessions for Apple to a large number of not even so much small developers as tiny developers or individuals. When they say this applies to 98%, they're talking in many cases about single developers making an app just as one person. They're not talking about small businesses. This cap at $1 million, how big of a company can you run on $1 million of revenue? Not very big at all. If you're running even a small company of 6 people, you might very well have expenses that run upwards of $1 million, and you will be paying Apple $150,000 even after this concession just to process credit cards on the App Store. That's obscene, but it becomes even more obscene the minute you go $1 over the $1 million. That concession or that commission is going to jump from $150,000 to $300,000. You're going to have to fire people at your small company just as it's taking off.
So I understand your point, although I've also seen it characterized today as the biggest change to the App Store since 2008. And although the changes might not be large enough to satisfy you now, I wonder, given their intransigence to date, if this might be the crack that opens for broader concessions.
I think this shows that Apple is indeed sweating. And they're not doing this because they just feel like, oh, this would be wonderful for developers. No, they're doing this because of all the pressure that's on them, from being named as one of the main perpetrators in the new congressional antitrust report, page after page of their antitrust abuses. Apple is clearly feeling the heat. So that's good. It's good that they're sweating, but the drops that they're dropping right now are insignificant. So the worst thing we could possibly do is to take this as like, oh, we won. Everything is great now. It's not great. Apple is just as abusive as it's always been. And this ploy to split the opposition to the abusive tactics in the App Store is actually just worse. It's more of the same. It's not fundamental change, and fundamental change is what we need.
If you were to be negotiating with Apple now, once they've made this one concession, what would you go back to them and say, okay, here's what I think you should do? First, I'm wondering, David, if you think this 15% is fair for under $1 million in revenue. Would you consider some sort of graded system? Would you say that 15% is a fair cut for companies of any size? What would be your negotiation with Apple right now?
The problem is I can't negotiate with Apple because Apple has all the leverage, and that's exactly the problem. For us to have a proper negotiation with Apple, there needs to be choice. If Apple actually had to compete with their payment processing system against the rest of the industry, like every other payment platform has to do, the tune would be completely different. When we negotiate with our payment processors, they're talking about basis point differences because the rates are so much lower. We pay perhaps around 2% or 2.5% at most. So Apple needs to give developers the choice. You can either choose to use the Apple payment system, and you get all the wonderful benefits that that brings. Consumers already have their credit cards in the system. It's very easy to use. There's very little friction. It has benefits. But unless there's real competition, we don't get to choose that, right? So give us the choice. Let us process payments directly ourselves, just as it's possible to do on the web. And then let us tell consumers about that, right? The other thing here is that Apple gags developers from telling consumers if they're using another system. If you open Netflix today, you just got a new phone, you install Netflix on it, and you're excited to sign up, it'll give you a locked, cryptic screen that essentially says, oh, you can't use Netflix right now. We know it's a bummer, but when you're a member, come back. What does that even mean?
Okay, so David.
Come back where? Where am I supposed to go?
Shepard Smith here. Thanks for watching CNBC on YouTube.